Blood soaked through the military dog's tactical vest and dripped onto the emergency room floor in a slow, steady rhythm. He stood motionless over the gurney, black eyes scanning every person who moved too fast, teeth bared just enough to make his position clear. 3 hospital security officers had their weapons drawn, 2 tasers, 1 actual firearm, all aimed at a 70-pound Belgian Malinois who was not going to move. The man on the gurney wasn't breathing. Nobody in the room knew what to do with that. The dog wouldn't let them close enough to confirm it. Every time a paramedic stepped forward, the animal shifted. Not lunging, not snapping, just repositioning with the kind of controlled precision that made everyone take a full step back. Then a nurse walked through the crowd, past the security line, past the drawn weapons, and placed herself between the dog and the guns. She said something, 2 words, maybe 3, in a language nobody in that room recognized. Not Spanish, not French, not anything from a high school curriculum. The dog sat down, just like that. The growling stopped. The weight shifted off his front legs. He sat beside the gurney like he'd been waiting for permission and looked up at the nurse with an expression that, on a human face, would have been relief. The room held its breath. Director Douglas Pierce stood at the edge of the ER bay with his arms crossed, watching. His expression hadn't changed, still the careful blankness of a man who had spent decades deciding what things were worth his attention. He'd already decided Emily Carter wasn't. If this story has you hooked, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter had been at Rivergate Medical Center for 14 months. She'd arrived in Ashford City the way some people arrive in places they didn't plan on, quietly, with a duffel bag and a lease signed over the phone and a forwarding address she'd given to exactly nobody. She rented a 1-bedroom near the Kelvin Street Bridge, bought second-hand furniture from an estate sale 2 blocks over, and showed up to her first shift at Rivergate with her scrubs already pressed and her hair already pulled back. She was 31. The other nurses assumed she was fresh out of a program somewhere, maybe a late starter, maybe someone who'd changed careers. She didn't correct them. She didn't offer much of anything, honestly. Not her background, not her history, not an explanation for why her hands never shook during procedures that made residents go pale, or why she could assess a trauma patient in the time it took most people to find a clipboard. She worked nights, mostly. She preferred it. Less oversight, more actual work, and the attending physicians who rotated through the night shift tended to be the ones interested in patient outcomes rather than department politics. The politics at Rivergate were something else. Director Pierce had built the hospital's administrative culture in his own image, which was to say organized, hierarchical, and deeply allergic to anyone who didn't fit the expected shape of things. He liked credentials he could read on paper, and authority that came with titles he recognized. He liked order. Emily had credentials she didn't talk about, authority she didn't use, and a very different understanding of order than anything Pierce had ever encountered. For 14 months, that tension had stayed quiet. She did her work. She kept her head down. She ate lunch alone in the break room, or sometimes not at all, and she went home to her apartment where the only living thing waiting for her was a cactus she'd bought at a gas station and named nothing because naming things made them harder to leave. She had no plans to leave Rivergate. She also made no plans to stay. She just worked. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Male, late 30s, unknown injuries, brought in by a private vehicle. No ambulance, no paramedics, just a black truck that pulled up to the ER bay and stopped with its engine still running while someone shoved open the passenger door. The dog was already outside when Emily got to the bay. He jumped out of the truck bed, that part came out later, from the security footage, and positioned himself beside the open passenger door before the man inside had even finished sliding out. The man was conscious, barely. He made it 3 steps before his legs stopped cooperating. Emily was the first nurse on scene. She registered the tactical vest on the dog before she registered anything else. The mole attachments, the weight of it, the way the animal moved with the man instead of around him. Working dog, handler down. She'd seen that configuration before, though not in an ER bay outside a civilian hospital in a mid-sized city at midnight. "Get a gurney," she said to the orderly behind her. Not a question. The man grabbed her wrist before she could step back. His grip was wrong. Too strong for someone losing that much blood, which meant the adrenaline was doing heavy lifting and they had less time than his vital signs would suggest. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something in her face went very still. "Gurney," she said again. Her voice hadn't changed at all. The ER bay became a problem quickly. The dog wouldn't leave the body. That was the word the residents started using once the man's heart stopped. Body, as if the transition happened gradually and they needed to mark it somehow. The resuscitation team had 22 minutes before they called it. 22 minutes during which the dog permitted exactly 2 people within arm's reach of the gurney, Emily and a second-year resident named Marcus Obi, who had the good instincts to move slowly and make no sudden sounds. Everyone else got the teeth. By the time Dr. Pierce arrived, summoned by the charge nurse after the security officers refused to engage the animal without direct authorization, the ER had essentially reorganized itself around the dog. Patients in adjacent bays had been moved. Staff clustered at the far end of the corridor. The 3 security officers stood in a loose triangle formation, none of them sure who was supposed to make the first move. Pierce assessed the situation in about 4 seconds and made a decision in 2 more. "Get animal control on the phone, and get that nurse." He pointed at Emily, who was standing at the foot of the gurney, still in her position, still watching the dog. "Away from that animal before it decides she's a threat." "She's not a threat to him," Marcus said. Pierce looked at the resident the way he looked at most residents, like they were furniture that had developed the inconvenient habit of speaking. "I didn't ask for commentary." Emily turned around. She hadn't been crying. That was the thing that the charge nurse, Sandra Voss, would remember afterward. Not that Emily was composed exactly, but that her face had the specific flatness of someone who had already finished feeling something and moved past it. Like she'd run through the whole cycle in the time it took everyone else to figure out there was a cycle to run through. "You're not putting him down," Emily said. Pierce clasped his hands in front of him. "Excuse me?" "The dog. You're already thinking about it. I can see it. He's injured. He won't let anyone close. It seems like the easy call." She glanced at the security officers. "It's not the right call. I don't take operational guidance from floor nurses, Ms. Carter. Emily Carter." She said it the way you say a thing you've said 1,000 times. Just a name, nothing behind it. "And I'm not giving you guidance. I'm telling you what's going to happen if you make the wrong move in the next 5 minutes. The room was very quiet. Pierce's expression didn't shift. "And what's that?" "He'll take someone's hand off. He's not feral, he's protective. There's a difference. Feral you can dart. Protective, you have to communicate. And right now, the only person in this building he's decided to communicate with is me." Pierce studied her for a long moment. Long enough that Sandra Voss started to think he was going to walk away, call someone, make it administrative. Instead, he said, "Handle it then." Chad. Emily approached the dog the way she'd approached him the first time. Straight on, no hesitation, making herself large enough to be seen and calm enough not to be a threat. She stopped a foot away and crouched down to his level. The dog watched her. She said something, the same pattern as before. 2 words, the inflection going down at the end, like a question that expected a specific answer. The dog's ears dropped. The tension went out of his shoulders. He shifted sideways, just enough, and put his head against her knee. She scratched behind his ear once, twice, and then her hand found the side of his vest. Her fingers moved over the fabric with the automatic competence of someone who had done this before, checking the clips, the compartments, the weight distribution. Her hand stopped. Marcus Obi, watching from 6 feet away, saw her expression change for the first time since the gurney had rolled in. Just a flicker, there and gone. But he'd later describe it as the look of someone who had just had a very specific fear confirmed. She stood up slowly. "He needs a vet," she said. "There's a 24-hour animal hospital on Delacroix Avenue, Ashford Veterinary Emergency. Call them, tell them you're sending a working military K9 with a GSW to the left flank and ask for Dr. Pruitt by name." "How do you know who to ask for?" Sandra asked. Emily didn't answer that. "Can someone drive him?" "Ms. Carter." Pierce's voice had gotten its edge back. "That dog is not a patient. What he is a liability, and he carried a message here." She looked at Pierce steadily. "Whatever happened tonight, Whatever that man on the gurney was doing and wherever he'd been, he came to this hospital specifically. The dog led the way specifically. She paused. You might want to know why before you start making decisions about things you don't have the context for. Pierce stared at her. Or don't, Emily said. That's also an option. What? She got the dog into a hospital transport vehicle by walking him there herself, one hand on his vest, moving at a pace that let him keep his weight off the injured side. The orderly driving, a 23-year-old named Joel, who would tell this story at every family dinner for the next decade, said she gave the dog a final command at the vehicle door, and the animal got in on his own and turned around and sat looking back at her with those dark eyes until the door closed. Joel said she stood there for a moment after the vehicle pulled away, just standing. Then she went back inside. What she didn't do, what Sandra Voss noticed and filed away without quite understanding, was go back to her other patients. She went to the supply corridor adjacent to the ER bay, the one with the lockers and the brake sink and the single flickering fluorescent that facilities had been promising to fix since February. She stood at the sink with the water running and looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she turned the water off, dried her hands, and walked back into the ER like nothing had happened. Pierce found her at the nursing station at 1:15 a.m. He'd spent the intervening hour on the phone. Emily could tell by the look on his face the specific quality of bureaucratic irritation that comes from being transferred between departments. He pulled up a chair across the station desk and sat in it with the deliberate posture of a man exercising patience. The man who was brought in, he said. Do you know him? Emily was entering chart notes. She didn't look up. I'd like to answer that question with a question, if that's all right. It's not, actually. Did you get an ID on him? Pierce's jaw tightened slightly. His identification is pending. There were no documents on his person, and the vehicle was registered to a shell company that our administrative staff is currently untangling. So, no, Emily said. Ms. Carter, I'd rather not have this conversation in the middle of a shift. She looked up. If you have official questions, I'll answer them officially, in a formal setting with whatever process Rivergate has for this kind of thing. This kind of thing, Pierce repeated. What kind of thing is that exactly? She held his gaze. A man died in your ER tonight without identification. A military working dog refused to leave his body. Your nursing staff demonstrated knowledge of that animal's command protocols. Those are 3 facts that exist in a specific kind of category, and I'd be careful about what informal conversation you have about it at a nursing station at 1 a.m. Pierce was quiet for a moment. You're one of my floor nurses, he said. You've been here 14 months. You've never asked for a promotion, never applied for a charge position, never caused problems, Emily said. Which makes this a strange night. It does. She went back to her chart. I'll be available for a formal conversation tomorrow morning. HR can set it up. Pierce stood. He straightened his jacket with the small, precise movements of a man who needed something to do with his hands. That dog, he said. You knew the command language. What was it? Emily didn't look up. Flemish Dutch. It's one of the standard training languages for European Line Malinois, less likely to be accidentally triggered by English commands. And you speak it? Enough, she said. She finished her shift at 7. She signed out, changed in the locker room, and walked to the parking structure with her bag over one shoulder and her keys in her hand. She sat in her car for 11 minutes without starting it. The man on the gurney had been Sergeant First Class Darian Wolfe. She hadn't said that to Pierce. She hadn't said it to anyone. But she'd known the moment she'd looked at his face in the ER bay, before his hand grabbed her wrist, before any of it. She'd known him the way you know people you've been in bad places with, people whose breathing pattern you can identify in the dark, people whose decision-making you've staked your life on. She'd staked her life on his once. Twice. More. He'd been retired. That's what she'd last heard 2 years ago, through channels that were already starting to go quiet by then. Medical discharge. The same kind of vague administrative phrasing they used when they didn't want to specify what part of a person had stopped working right. She hadn't pushed for details. She'd had her own paperwork to deal with. What she couldn't figure out, sitting in her car in the Rivergate parking structure as the morning shift change traffic moved around her, was what he'd been doing in Ashford City, what he'd been doing in a civilian context, with a working dog in full tactical gear, with injuries that looked less like an accident and more like someone had found him. The command she'd given the dog was a search and report order. It was what you said when you needed the animal to show you something. He'd responded to it, which meant his training was current, which meant someone had been maintaining it, which meant Darian Wolfe hadn't been as retired as the paperwork suggested. She drove home. She showered. She stood in her kitchen and drank half a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the Kelvin Street Bridge for a while. She thought about the way his hand had felt on her wrist. Not panicked, purposeful, like he'd been trying to transfer something. She thought about what she'd felt when her hand moved over the dog's tactical vest in the ER bay. The specific weight of one of the compartments that shouldn't have had anything in it. She hadn't taken anything out. She'd stopped herself. She'd gotten up and started talking about the vet on Delacroix Avenue because she needed time to think, and thinking required distance, and distance required getting the dog out of that room before someone else started checking his vest. She was back at Rivergate by 9:30. She wasn't scheduled. She told the front desk she'd forgotten her personal kit in her locker, which was plausible enough that they buzzed her through without comment. She went to the locker room, spent 40 seconds there, and came back out. Then she went to the administrative wing. Sandra Voss intercepted her at the second-floor landing. "Pierce wants to see you," Sandra said. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone trying to warn you without technically warning you. "He's been in his office since 7:30. "I know," Emily said. "I'm going." "Emily." Sandra stopped her with a hand on her arm. Not grabbing, just resting. "There were some calls this morning, to the hospital's main line, from a number our system flagged as government." Emily looked at her. Sandra kept her voice low. "Pierce's assistant said he took the call privately and then spent about 20 minutes on his computer looking at your personnel file." The information landed. Emily processed it the way she processed most things, quickly, quietly, without showing the math on her face. "Thanks, Sandra," she said. "Whatever's happening, I'll handle it." She took the stairs to the third floor and walked to Pierce's office and knocked once before opening the door. Pierce was at his desk. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was interesting because she doubted he was capable of caring about the things that would have kept him awake. There was something else in his face, a recalibration, like a man trying to hold a position he'd already started to doubt. He looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down, Ms. Carter," he said. His voice was different. Not warmer. Pierce didn't run warm, but more careful, like he was handling something he'd just discovered was heavier than he'd thought. She sat. "I received a call this morning," he said, "from a government office I'm not going to name in this conversation. The nature of that call," he stopped, adjusted, started again. "I was made aware that last night's incident may involve matters that fall outside this hospital's administrative jurisdiction." Emily waited. "I was also made aware," Pierce continued, "that your personnel file, as submitted to Rivergate Medical Center, is," he chose the word carefully, "incomplete." "I applied for the position I hold," Emily said. "My nursing credentials are current and verified." "That's not what I mean, and I think you know that." She was quiet. Pierce leaned back. "The phone call I received suggested that I should extend you whatever operational cooperation you require." Those were the exact words used. Operational cooperation. "That's good advice," Emily said. His expression did something complicated. Pierce was not a man who liked being in a room where someone else knew more than he did. He'd built an entire institutional culture to prevent that feeling. "Who are you, Ms. Carter?" Emily picked up her bag. "Right now. I'm your 14-month floor nurse who came in on her day off." She stood. "I need to make a call from somewhere private. I'll use the family consultation room on 2 if that's all right." Pierce stared at her. "If it's not all right," she said, "I'll step outside." He made a gesture with one hand that meant do whatever you need, and she took it and she left. She didn't make a phone call. She sat in the family consultation room, beige walls, box of tissues on the table, the specific stillness of a room that had absorbed too much bad news. And she put her bag on the table and opened it and took out what she'd actually gone to the locker room to retrieve. It wasn't from her personal kit. Joel, The orderly who'd driven the dog to Delacroix Avenue was thorough and fast and had the useful quality of not asking questions he suspected he didn't want answered. Emily had asked him, very quietly, at the end of his shift, whether the dog had been managed by anyone before the vet got to him. Joel had said no. The vet tech had come out to the vehicle and they'd gone straight through. The vest had been removed by the veterinary staff and set aside. Joel had also mentioned, without being asked, that when he'd been waiting in the parking lot, he'd noticed one of the vest's side pockets had been unclipped, like someone had opened it and closed it again in a hurry. The item Emily had taken from her locker, the item that had been waiting there, placed before she arrived, which told her the timing of things she hadn't wanted to calculate yet, was a small folded card, the kind of waterproof card they used in field applications. Treated paper, graphite pencil, 3 lines of text. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a moment, both hands flat on the table, looking at the words without reading them anymore. Darian Wolfe had been dead for 4 hours before she'd walked back into this building. He'd known, when he sent that dog into that emergency room, that he probably wasn't making it out. He'd sent the dog anyway. He'd gotten himself to Ashford City, to this hospital, to the one person in the civilian world he apparently still trusted, because he'd found something. The 3 lines on the card told her what? They also told her that whoever had shot him wasn't far. The family consultation room had a window that faced the interior courtyard. Emily looked out at the courtyard. The planter boxes, the stone path, the bench where oncology patients sometimes sat with their families on good days, and let herself think clearly for the first time since 11:47 the previous night. Darian had been methodical. He wouldn't have made a move like this without documentation, wouldn't have sent the dog without making sure there was a trail that could be followed if Emily got the card, but couldn't read what it meant. There would be something else, something in or on the dog's vest, or something in the hospital itself, or something already moving through channels she needed to identify before anyone else did. She folded the card and put it in her breast pocket. Then her pager went off. Not her hospital pager, the personal one she'd kept charged and clipped to her bag for 2 years without anyone at Rivergate ever noticing, because nobody looked at what a floor nurse carried in her bag. She looked at the display. The number was one she recognized. She hadn't expected to see it again. She was already moving toward the door when the overhead intercom clicked on. "Security to the main entrance. Security to the main entrance, please." The tone of it was wrong. Too fast, slightly compressed, not the bored cadence of a routine announcement. Someone had pressed the button in a hurry. Emily came out of the consultation room into the corridor and looked toward the main entrance stairwell, 2 floors down and across the building. Through the interior windows she could see the lobby, the front desk, the usual morning traffic, the glass doors, and 4 men in dark clothing who had just walked through them, moving with a gait that had nothing to do with visiting hours. She took the stairs, not because the elevator was slower, it wasn't, not by much, but because the stairwell had a landing window that overlooked the lobby from an angle the security cameras didn't cover, and she wanted 30 seconds to look at those 4 men before they knew she was looking. She got to the landing on the first-floor mezzanine and stopped. From above and through the wired glass, she could see the lobby clearly enough. The 4 men had split, 2 at the main desk talking to the receptionist, 1 near the door, 1 moving toward the corridor that led to the administrative wing. They weren't flashing badges, which meant either they didn't have them or they were waiting to use them. Their clothing was tactical without being obvious about it. Dark pants, fitted jackets, the kind of shoes that cost twice what they looked like they cost. Not law enforcement, not federal agents doing a routine follow-up. The one near the corridor entrance paused and looked up. Not at the landing window, just up, the automatic scan of someone trained to read vertical space. Emily pulled back before the angle changed. She went back up to 3. Pierce's office was 40 feet down the hall. His door was open, which meant his assistant was probably at the front of the suite and could see anyone coming. Emily went the other direction, toward the records annex that nobody used before noon, and she pulled out the personal pager and looked at the number again. She needed a phone that wasn't the hospital system. She found one in the annex, an old landline, the kind with the coiled cord that facilities kept meaning to remove. She picked up the receiver, checked for a dial tone, and dialed the number from memory. It rang twice.
"You're either very fast or you are already moving," said the voice on the other end. "Already moving," Emily said. "Who's in my building?" "We don't know yet."
That's the short answer. Give me the longer one. A pause. Not hesitation, more like selection, the way someone talks when they're deciding how much information the situation actually requires. Wolf made contact with our office 48 hours before last night. He had documentation, physical, not digital. He didn't trust the network after what happened in Ogren. He said he was going to route it through a cutout and then go to ground. The dog, Emily said. We think so. The documentation was never transmitted to us directly. If you use the animal as a courier, then whoever came after him knows that. And knows the dog ended up at your hospital. Yes. Emily looked at the door. The annex had one entrance and one window, and the window faced the interior courtyard, which was 3 floors down. The vest, she said. The vet on Delacroix. Did you? We have someone en route, but if those men in your lobby get there first, they won't. She said it before she'd fully decided it was true. How long do I have? We don't know what they're there for yet. They might just be watching. They split on entry, one's heading toward admin. She thought about that. They're looking for a conversation, not a confrontation, something they can do quietly. Or they're buying time until a third party arrives. That landed differently. Emily pressed her hand flat against the wall next to the phone and looked at the ceiling for a moment, running through what she knew about the timing. Darian in the ER bay at midnight, the dog at the vet by 1:30, her back in the building by 9:30, and it was now just past 10. The card, she said. The 3 lines. We need you to read it to us. I know what it means. Emily, it means he found the source. It means it's not external. The breach in the Ogren operation, he found where it came from, and it's... She stopped, reorganized. I need an hour. You don't have an hour. Those men, stall them. She put the receiver down. She didn't let herself think about Darian Wolf again. That was a decision she'd made at the sink in the supply corridor at 1 in the morning, and she was holding to it. Not because the grief wasn't there, but because grief had a weight that slowed you down, and right now she needed to be fast. She went back down to 2, to the consultation room, and she picked up her bag. Then she walked to the nursing station on the south wing and found Marcus Obi writing a patient note with the distracted focus of a man running on 4 hours of sleep. I need a favor, she said. Marcus looked up. Whatever he saw in her face made him put the pen down. Okay. The annex on 3. There's an old landline. If anyone asks to use a secure hospital communication line in the next hour, route them there. Tell them it's the only terminal with the clearance access they need. Is that true? No. But it'll take them about 20 minutes to figure that out, and by then it won't matter. She held his gaze. Don't put yourself in the middle of this, Marcus. Just the phone. That's all. What are you doing? My job, she said, and meant it in a way that didn't have anything to do with Rivergate Medical Center. She left before he could ask anything else. Duts. The Veterinary Emergency Center on Delacroix Avenue was a 20-minute drive in light traffic, and Emily made it in 14. She'd taken her personal car and paid for parking with cash, which was not something she'd consciously planned, and which told her that certain instincts were coming back faster than she'd expected. Dr. Pruitt was a compact woman in her mid-50s with the efficient manner of someone who treated emergencies as puzzles rather than disasters. She met Emily in the back corridor, away from the front desk and the 2 staff members working the morning intake. He's stable, Pruitt said without preamble. GSW, left flank, went through clean, no organ involvement. He's sedated right now. The vest, where is it? Pruitt looked at her steadily. You're not the first person who's asked me that this morning. Emily went still. Who else? A man. About an hour ago. Said he was from the Department of Defense. Had a card. Looked right. Asked about the dog's equipment. What did you tell him? That we'd inventoried the vest per standard protocol, and it was in secure storage. Pruitt paused. Which is true. It's in my office. Under my desk. In a locked cabinet I've had since 2003, and I didn't tell him that part. Emily let out a breath that wasn't quite relief. Dr. Pruitt,
I've been a veterinarian for 30 years, Pruitt said, in a tone that indicated she was done being spoken to like someone who needed context. I've worked with military dogs. I know what a DoD credential looks like, and I know what someone looks like when they're using a real one. She met Emily's eyes. He wasn't. No, Emily agreed. He wasn't. Pruitt turned and led her down the corridor without another word. Down.
The tactical vest was in the cabinet, as advertised. Pruitt unlocked it, set the vest on her desk, and stepped back to the doorway. Close enough to see, far enough to make it clear she understood the distinction between what was her business and what wasn't. Emily went through it methodically. The compartments she'd already cataloged in her memory from the ER bay: mole grid, left side panel, right side panel, the collar attachment point. She'd felt the weight of the left side panel in the ER bay and stopped herself from checking it. She checked it now. There was a second card. Same waterproof material, same graphite pencil. But this one wasn't 3 lines, it was a reference. An 8-character alphanumeric sequence and a location descriptor that read RWGTE/admin level 2/crossref filing. RWGTE. Rivergate. Emily stood with the card in her hand and felt the particular quality of stillness that comes right before a situation becomes irreversible. Darian had been to this hospital before, had accessed the administrative level, had cross-referenced something in the filing system, paper, not digital, because digital left footprints and Darian knew better than most how footprints got used. Whatever he'd found had been hidden inside Rivergate Medical Center, and she'd been working 14 months in the same building without knowing it was there. She took a photo of the card with her personal phone, replaced it exactly as she'd found it, and resecured the vest. "The man who came this morning," she said to Pruitt. "Did he touch anything?" "I didn't leave him unattended." "Did he try?" Pruitt's expression was dry. "He tried to look at the intake forms. I gave him the public-facing version." Emily looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Pruitt said. "Just make sure that dog has somewhere decent to go when this is done." Well, she was back at Rivergate by 11:15. The 4 men in the lobby were down to 2, visible, at least. The other pair could have gone anywhere, which was a problem she couldn't solve without more information. She went in through the side entrance off the Kellerman Street parking structure, used her badge, and took the back corridor to the administrative level. Level 2 admin was where the non-clinical records lived. Historical files, credentialing archives, contractor agreements, the kind of documentation that hospitals generated in enormous quantities and then struggled to store because the digital systems were never quite complete and someone always kept the paper. Emily had been on this floor twice in 14 months, both times to pull credentialing verification for patients with unusual insurance situations. She knew the layout. She also knew that the records room in the back had a clerk, a part-time position, a rotating roster, and that the Tuesday morning clerk was a woman named Peggy Hartwell, who had been at Rivergate for 19 years and who Emily had once helped through a complicated shift change when Peggy's car died in the parking structure in December. Peggy was at her desk when Emily pushed open the records room door. "Emily?" Peggy looked surprised, which was reasonable. "You're not on today." "I know, I'm looking for something for Dr. Riley." The name of the most administratively busy attending she could think of. "Patient file cross-reference. It's old enough it might only be in paper." Peggy waved at the back shelves. "You know how it's organized." "I do. Thanks, Peggy." She didn't go to the patient files. She went to the contractor records, the section that housed vendor agreements, consulting contracts, equipment leases, and she started with the alphanumeric sequence from the card. It took her 6 minutes to find it. The file was thin, 4 pages, paper-clipped, tucked inside a standard contractor agreement folder with a name on the tab that she almost passed over. Cross N. Consulting Agreement, Surgical Advisory Board, executed 2021. Dr. Nathan Cross. She knew the name. She'd never had a direct interaction with him. He was attending surgical staff. She was floor nursing. The overlap was minimal by design in a hospital Pierce's size. She'd seen him in passing, 50s, authoritative bearing, the kind of man who moved through hospital corridors like the space belonged to him. She'd clocked him the way she clocked everyone, reflex more than interest. and hadn't thought about him again. She opened the file. The consulting agreement was standard on its face, but clipped behind it, in Darian's handwriting, she knew it the way she knew his grip, she would have known it in the dark, were 3 pages of notes, dates, names, reference numbers, a timeline that started in 2019 and ended 7 months ago. She read it once, fast. Then she read it again slowly, because the first pass had made her hands cold, and she wanted to make sure she was reading it correctly. She was. Nathan Cross hadn't been consulting for Rivergate's Surgical Advisory Board. The agreement was real. She could see Pierce's signature, the board's countersignature, but the dates in Darian's notes showed something else running alongside it. A second relationship. Financial transfers routed through a subsidiary that didn't appear in any public record Emily could verify right now, but which Darian had mapped with the meticulous care of a man who understood that the only way to dismantle something was to document it first. The Ogren mission. 3 years ago. 4 dead, 2 wounded, 1 survivor who'd been medically discharged under conditions that were never fully explained. The mission that had ended Emily's unit and effectively ended her military career, wrapped in an administrative finding of operational failure that nobody had been willing to examine too closely. The source of the intelligence breach that had gotten those 4 people killed was in Darian's handwriting on the second page. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. They're coming to admin. Marcus. It had to be Marcus, passing something along from whoever had tried to use the annex phone and gotten rerouted. Or someone else. She didn't have time to figure out which. She took photos of all 3 pages. Then she replaced the file exactly where she'd found it, walked back to Peggy's desk, and said, "Found it. It was misfiled. Tell Dr. Riley I'll send him the reference number." Peggy nodded without looking up. Emily was through the records room door and moving down the corridor before it had fully closed behind her. She was 20 feet from the stairwell when Douglas Pierce came around the corner. He wasn't alone. One of the men from the lobby was with him, not presenting as an escort, standing just far enough back to maintain plausible distance, but Emily read the configuration immediately. Pierce's body language was wrong. Too upright, the specific overcorrection of someone trying to look unaffected by something that was affecting them considerably. Pierce saw her and stopped. Something moved through his expression. Surprise, then calculation, then a decision she couldn't fully read. "Ms. Carter," he said it carefully. "I was just told you'd come in." "I had some things to follow up on," she said. The man behind Pierce was looking at her with the focused neutrality of a professional assessment. Emily didn't look back at him long enough to make it a staring contest. "Could we speak privately?" Pierce said. "Of course." He led her to the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one used for credentialing reviews and vendor meetings. The man from the lobby didn't follow them in. Pierce closed the door and stood in front of it with his arms crossed, which told her he was either about to deliver something uncomfortable or had already been told to deliver it and was still deciding how. "You need to leave the building," he said. Emily looked at him. "Not permanently," he said quickly. This isn't a termination. I need you to understand that. But there are people here who need access to certain records, and they've indicated that your presence, who sent them? I can't tell you that." "Can't or won't?" Pierce's jaw tightened. "Carter, they showed you credentials," Emily said. "Official-looking credentials from an agency or an office that sounded important enough that you decided cooperating was the path of least resistance. And now you're standing in front of a closed door telling me to leave the building." She kept her voice level. "Director Pierce, with respect, you have no idea what you've been asked to participate in." "I know exactly. You don't." She said it simply, without heat. "The man who died in your ER last night was a decorated federal operative. He came to this hospital specifically because someone inside it is the reason 4 soldiers died 3 years ago. The people who sent those men downstairs are not here to investigate that. They're here to manage it." Pierce went very still. "If you ask me to leave," Emily said, "I'll leave. I'm not going to make this harder for you than it has to be. But I want you to understand that what happens in the next few hours will happen regardless, and the only question is whether Rivergate is on the right side of it." The silence stretched. Pierce unfolded his arms. He put one hand on the back of the nearest chair and looked at it for a moment, not at her. "What do you need?" he said finally. Emily had not expected that. She recalibrated fast. Access to the administrative records room for another 20 minutes without anyone noting my presence. Done. And the main conference room on this floor needs to be unavailable until I tell you otherwise. I'll have my assistant put a systems update notice on it. Thank you. She moved toward the door. "Carter?" His voice stopped her. She turned. Pierce was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not respect exactly, more like the first stages of it, reluctant and confused, the look of a man reconfiguring something he'd already filed away. "The phone call I got this morning. They told me you were a problem." "That's about right," she said. She left before he could say anything else. Tick. The records room was clear. Peggy had gone to the break room. Emily could see through the glass. And she was back in the contractor files with her phone camera in 90 seconds. She wasn't looking for more of Darian's notes. She was looking for cross-references, for anything with the subsidiary name from his timeline, for paper that connected to paper in the way bureaucratic cover-ups always eventually did, because the people who built them were meticulous about their official documentation and believed they were too insulated to worry about someone being meticulous right back. She found 2 more files. One was a vendor agreement. One was a travel reimbursement record. And on the travel reimbursement record, dated 14 months ago, was a signature she recognized. Not from Rivergate, from Ogren. She stared at it. The authorized signatory on a Rivergate Medical Center internal travel reimbursement form was a name that appeared exactly once in the classified operational debrief she'd had to sign 3 ND-AS to participate in, and which she had not thought about in over a year. Because thinking about it accomplished nothing, and she was not a person who spent energy on things that accomplished nothing. She took the photo. She forwarded it to the number from the original page. She put her phone in her pocket, and then she walked out of the records room and straight into Nathan Cross, who had apparently been walking very fast from the opposite direction and who pulled up short with the startled recovery of a man who was not used to being caught off balance. He was tall, early 50s probably, with the kind of physical authority that comes from decades of institutional confidence. His eyes went to her badge. Floor nurse, not someone he'd have cataloged as significant, and then to her face. "Excuse me," he said, stepping to one side. Emily stepped to the other side at the same moment, which was just traffic geometry. But she looked at his face in the half-second they were stopped, and she saw it. The slight tension above his jaw. The very controlled quality of his attention on her badge. The way his eyes hadn't quite gone back to neutral. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know it was her. Not yet. "Sorry," she said, and moved past him. She was at the stairwell door before she let herself process what had just happened. Cross had been heading toward the records room, which meant either he'd been told about the investigation or he'd been monitoring it himself, which meant the men in the lobby weren't managing the situation on his behalf. They were here because he'd made a call. Because Darian showing up at Rivergate had scared him, and a scared man with 18 months of access to a hospital's administrative infrastructure was a man capable of making things disappear very quickly. She took the stairs down 2 floors and came out near the ER bay and stood in the corridor for 3 seconds thinking. Then she pulled out her phone and called the number again. "The documentation is in the contractor files on level 2 admin," she said when it picked up. "Third shelf from the left, vendor agreement section, file labeled Cross. There are also 2 additional files. I've sent you photos of all of it." "We have them." "Emily, listen. He's in the building, Cross. He was heading toward the records room." A short silence. "How long ago?" 2 minutes. "Is the documentation still in place?" "Yes. I didn't move it." Okay. We need you to..." "I know what you need me to do," Emily said. "I need you to tell me how long." "We have a team in Ashford. They were already staged for a different operation, but we can redirect 90 minutes, maybe less." 90 minutes was a long time. 90 minutes was long enough for a man with access and motivation to locate and destroy 4 pages of handwritten notes that nobody else in this building knew existed. "Faster," she said. "We're moving as fast as..." "Faster." She hung up. She stood in the ER corridor and looked at the bay where Darian Wolfe had died 6 hours ago. The gurney was stripped and clean.
The floor had been mopped.
There was nothing left of him in this space, which was how it always went. The hospital absorbed its tragedies and reset, because the alternative was unusable. She thought about the 4 names on the second page of Darian's notes, soldiers she'd known. One of them had been 24 years old, from a small town outside of Baton Rouge, who used to organize card games to pass time between missions, and who owed Emily $40 from a hand she'd never collected on. She thought about the reimbursement form with the wrong signature on it. 14 months ago. Around the time she'd arrived in Ashford City, which was not a coincidence she could afford to examine right now, she moved. Back upstairs, different route. The service elevator on the east side, up to 2, came out behind the administrative wing instead of in front of it. She went to the records room and looked through the glass. The file was gone. The shelf was there, the other files were there, and the space where the cross-contractor agreement had been filed was empty. She couldn't see Peggy, still on break or somewhere else, and she couldn't see anyone in the room, which meant whoever had taken the file had been fast and had known exactly where to look. Emily stood at the glass for one breath. Then she went to find Nathan Cross. She didn't have a plan. That was the honest version of what was happening. She had information, she had photos on her phone, she had a team 90 minutes out, and she had a man who had just taken physical evidence from a hospital records room and who was the only person who could tell her how much more there was and where it was. She found him in the surgical suite corridor on level 3. He was alone, moving toward the physician lounge with the unhurried pace of a man who had just done something and was now performing normalcy. Emily fell into step behind him at a distance that was close enough to be intentional. He felt it. He turned. For a moment they just looked at each other. A floor nurse and an attending surgeon in a hospital corridor at 11:40 in the morning, with nothing formally wrong with the picture and everything actually wrong with it. "Dr. Cross," Emily said, "can I help you?" "You took something from the records room." His expression went through 3 things very fast: surprise, assessment, and then a recalibration that landed on a kind of cold composure she recognized. She'd seen it before on people who'd made decisions they couldn't unmake and had moved past the point of second-guessing themselves. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "The contractor file. Under your name. There was additional documentation in it, handwritten notes. I'd like to know where you've put them." The corridor was empty. That was the bad news. The good news was that they were under ceiling cameras. Emily had checked angles habitually enough that she knew which corners were covered, and Cross knew that too, which was the only reason she was comfortable having this conversation at all. "You're a floor nurse," he said. "You have no business in administrative records." And yet, he studied her. The composure was still there, but underneath it something had sharpened. She could see him running calculations, assessing what she knew versus what she might know, trying to figure out how much danger she actually represented. "You're very confident for someone with nothing behind her," he said. "I have photos," Emily said, "of everything in that file before you took it, and I have a team coming to this hospital in," she checked the time, "about 75 minutes. So the question isn't whether what Sergeant Wolf documented is going to come out. The question is whether it comes out in a way that acknowledges you cooperated." Something moved in Cross's face. Not fear, not quite. More like the specific resignation of a chess player watching the board 10 moves ahead and understanding that every remaining option ends the same way. "You knew Wolf," he said. "Yes. He was more thorough than I expected. He always was." Her voice didn't change. She didn't let it. Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, at the corridor, at the empty space she'd just come through. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, reaching for something, a phone, Emily thought, or... Her pager went off. Not the personal one, the hospital pager. She looked at it reflexively. Code blue, ER Bay 2. And in the 2 seconds her eyes were down, Cross moved. Not running, just gone. Through the door at the end of the corridor, the one that connected to the physician lounge and from there to the back elevator bank. And by the time Emily processed the movement and got to the door, the hallway on the other side was empty. She stood in the doorway with her hospital pager going off in her hand, and the code blue sounding from the overhead speakers and Nathan Cross somewhere in a building he knew better than she did, with Darian's documentation in his possession and 75 minutes on a clock that had just gotten a great deal more complicated. She went to the Code Blue anyway. Not because she'd forgotten about Cross, she hadn't forgotten a single thing, but because a Code Blue was a patient dying and she was still a nurse and some responses were below the level of conscious decision. She was in the ER bay in under 2 minutes, and the patient was a 63-year-old man in V-fib who'd come in with chest pain 40 minutes ago and whose rhythm had just gone somewhere nobody wanted it to go. Marcus was already on compressions. Emily took the airway. For the next 11 minutes, she did not think about Nathan Cross or Darian Wolfe or the empty shelf in the records room. She thought about airway position and compression depth and the specific quality of this man's color under the bay lights, and whether the second round of epi was going to do what they needed it to do. It did. Barely. His rhythm came back ragged and too fast, and they lost it once more before it settled. But it came back. The attending called it. The man got wheeled toward the ICU with a tube down his throat and 3 nurses jogging alongside him, and Marcus looked at Emily across the empty bay with the dazed expression of someone remembering there was a world outside this room. "You okay?" he said. "I need you to do something," she said. He didn't say yes or no. He waited. Level 2 admin, the records room. There's a gap on the 3rd shelf, vendor agreement section, a file that was there an hour ago and isn't anymore. I need you to go look at the shelf and tell me if anything's been put back. Emily, I know. I'll explain when I can. Right now I need eyes in that room and I can't be the one there. She met his gaze. 2 minutes, in and out. Marcus pulled off his gloves. Fine. She watched him go. Then she pulled out her personal phone and called the number again. It went to voicemail. A generic automated message, no name. And she said, "He's mobile inside the building. He accessed the records room and removed the physical documentation. I have the photos, but the originals are gone. I need to know if your team can verify the subsidiary transfers independently, because if the paper trail disappears..." She stopped. She'd heard something. Down the corridor toward the stairwell she'd come from, there was a sound. Not loud, not alarming on its own, but wrong in the specific way that a space sounds wrong when someone is trying not to make noise and not entirely succeeding. She'd spent enough time in places where that distinction mattered to register it immediately. She ended the call. The ER corridor was long and mostly empty at this hour. Late morning lull between the overnight admits and the afternoon walk-ins. A transport aide at the far end, a physician disappearing into a bay. Nothing between her and the stairwell door. She walked toward it anyway. The stairwell was empty. But the door to the sublevel, the basement, where biomedical engineering lived, and the server room and the records archive that nobody called the archive because it had been rebranded twice, was not fully closed. It sat 3 inches open with the kind of deliberate imprecision of something left that way on purpose. Emily stood at the top of the sublevel stairs and listened. Footsteps, below. One set. Moving with purpose but not running. The pace of someone who knew where they were going and wanted to get there before being followed. Not the pace of someone who thought they were already caught. She went down. The sublevel was institutional in the specific way of places that existed to serve the building rather than the people in it. Concrete floor, overhead conduit, fluorescent lighting on a motion-sensing delay that meant half the space was always one step behind you, the lights coming on in your wake as you moved. Emily had been here once, 6 months ago, following a facilities request. She knew there was one main corridor, 2 branch points, and a dead end at the back where the archive shelving unit stood. Cross was at the far end when she rounded the second branch. He hadn't heard her. He was at the shelving units with a box on the floor beside him and a folder in his hands. Moving fast, pulling pages, looking at them and sorting them into 2 piles with the frantic efficiency of a man who was past pretending he was doing anything legitimate. Emily watched him for 4 seconds. Then she said, "The photos are already transmitted." Cross spun around. The folder went sideways and papers scattered, and he grabbed for them with the automatic reflex of a man who'd spent years managing documents, and then stopped, because grabbing them was pointless, and some part of him knew it. He straightened. In better light, she could see what she'd missed in the corridor upstairs. The slight dishevelment, the quality of his breathing. He was scared.
Not the cold calculation she'd read in the hallway, but something raw underneath it, the actual human response that the composure had been sitting on top of. Transmitted to who? He said. People who've been building this case for 2 years, Emily said. Wolf didn't find you last week. He found you 18 months ago. Everything since then was documentation. Cross looked at the papers on the floor. Something in his face went through a process she couldn't fully track. Recalculation, maybe, or the specific exhaustion of a man realizing the scope of how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. You have no legal authority here, he said. It came out thinner than he'd intended. No, Emily agreed. I'm a floor nurse. I can't arrest you. I can't compel you. I can't do anything officially. But the team that can is 40 minutes out. And the question you need to be sitting with right now is what the difference is between cooperating and not cooperating, because the file in your hands doesn't change what they already have. The file in my hands is the only physical evidence, the subsidiary, Vantegra Holdings. She said the name and watched his face. 14 months of transfers, routed through a contractor agreement that you co-signed with a man who died in the Ogren operation. The same operation you provided intelligence for. The financial records aren't in this building, Dr. Cross. They've been in federal hands for 6 weeks. The lights in the corridor behind her came on. Motion sensor, catching up. It made the space brighter and Cross's face more visible and the papers on the floor between them somehow more consequential than they'd looked in the dimness. You were there, Cross said. He was looking at her differently now. In Ogren. I was. You were the medic. A pause. The one they couldn't account for in the after-action report. Emily didn't say anything. Wolf came to you specifically, Cross said. Not to anyone in the official chain. He came to you. He trusted me, Emily said, which is more than I can say for most of what happened in that operation. Cross looked at the folder in his hand. He looked at it for a long moment, the specific gaze of a man in a conversation with himself about whether there was any version of the next 5 minutes that went differently. Then he set the folder down on the shelf beside him, not throwing it, not dropping it, setting it down. The 4 soldiers, Emily said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, flatter. The way you talk about things that are too large for inflection. Sergeant Maris Tran, Corporal Devin Achebe, Specialist Reese Hollowell, Private First Class Luca Odemba. She let the names settle. They were 24 to 31 years old. They had families. Odemba had a daughter born 4 months after he died who has never known anything about who her father was because the operational records were sealed. Cross said nothing. You gave their position to the wrong people, Emily said. Not by accident. It's more complicated. It's not. She stepped forward, not threatening, just closing the distance between abstraction and accountability. You made a choice for money, and 4 people died because of it. And then you spent 3 years in this hospital collecting a salary and a reputation while their families got folded flags and no answers. The silence in the sub-level was its own kind of sound. Cross put both hands in his pockets. It was a posture Emily recognized. Not aggression, not preparation for flight. Containment. The physical management of something that had gotten too large for the space it was being kept in. What happens now? He said. Now we go upstairs and wait for the team. And if I... He didn't finish the sentence, which told her he'd already run the math on the alternatives and arrived at the same answer she had. There was nowhere in this building that was more useful to him than where he was standing. The exits were watched. He didn't know that, not specifically, but the 4 men from the lobby hadn't disappeared, and Cross was not a stupid man. I'd like to call my attorney, he said. That's your right. Emily picked up the folder from the shelf and tucked it under her arm. Upstairs. Or she put Cross in the main conference room on level 2 with the door closed and Pierce's assistant, a young man named Terrence, who had the composure of someone who'd worked for Pierce long enough to have seen unusual things, sitting outside with instructions to note anyone who approached and let Emily know. Then she stood in the hallway and called the number again. This time it picked up on the first ring. We're 22 minutes out, the voice said. Do you have Cross? He's contained, not under arrest, not officially. He's in a conference room. Is he cooperative? He's calculating.
Emily looked at the closed conference room door. He set the files down. That's something. The subsidiary records check out on our end. The Federal Financial Forensics team has been building the Vantegra case independently. Cross's name is on 6 of the transfer authorizations. Combined with Wolf's documentation, it's enough? It was enough before today. Today makes it airtight. Emily leaned against the corridor wall. The fluorescent overhead hummed. Down the hall, a cart went by, and someone was laughing at something in the break room. A normal hospital sound, the ordinary percussion of people working through a Tuesday, and it felt strangely far away from where she was standing. "The 4 men in the lobby," she said. "Who sent them?" A pause. "We're still working on that. Our current read is they're private contractors, the kind of arrangement Cross had access to through the Vantegra network, but we haven't confirmed the chain of command. So they might not know it's over." "Possibly." Emily looked at the stairwell at the end of the hall. "That's a problem." "We know. Our team is coming in with full authorization, DOJ and DOD joint. The paperwork is solid. When we arrive, those contractors will be asked to stand down. If they don't, they'll want to get to Cross first," Emily said. "Before you do. If he talks, I know." On 22 minutes is, "I know, Emily." The voice had an edge now, not impatience, urgency. The difference mattered. "We need you to keep him in that room and keep him safe. Can you do that?" She almost said she was a floor nurse. She didn't. "Yes." She ended the call and pushed off from the wall. Marcus appeared at the stairwell door. He was breathing slightly faster than normal, and his expression had the specific quality of someone who had just seen something they hadn't expected. "The shelf," Emily said. "What did you find?" "Nothing." He crossed toward her. "The shelf was empty where you said, but Emily, when I was leaving, one of those men from the lobby, the ones who came in this morning, he was in the records room. He wasn't looking at files. He was photographing the shelf." Marcus stopped in front of her. "The empty shelf." Emily's brain processed that in one beat. They weren't trying to find the documentation. They were documenting the absence of it, building a record that the file never existed or had been tampered with, creating a counter-narrative to any chain of evidence before the federal team arrived. "How long ago?" she said. 3 minutes, maybe 4. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so." She thought fast. The photos on her phone were time-stamped. The metadata would show when they were taken relative to when the shelf was emptied. That kind of evidentiary sequence was exactly what a federal forensics team could use to establish the manipulation. But only if her phone was secured before anyone asked her to surrender it. "I need you to do one more thing," she said. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who had stopped expecting the request to be normal. "What?" "Take my phone. Don't let anyone ask you for it. If someone approaches you, you don't know you have it. You found it in the break room, whatever you need to say. Just don't let it leave your person for the next 20 minutes. "Emily, Marcus." She looked at him directly. "The people who died because of what's in those photos, they were real people. They have families who have been waiting 3 years to know what happened." She held out the phone. 20 minutes. He took it. She went back to the conference room. Cross was sitting at the table when she came in, not pacing, not at the door, just sitting with both hands flat on the table in front of him, looking at a spot on the wall. He looked older than he had in the corridor, smaller. The authoritative bearing had gone somewhere, deflated by the specific gravity of a situation that couldn't be managed anymore. Emily sat across from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The soldiers," Cross said. "I want you to know, it wasn't supposed to—" "Don't." She said it quietly. "Don't tell me what it was supposed to be. Tell that to the federal team when they get here. Tell it to the families, but don't tell me." Cross closed his mouth. Emily sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the table and listened to the building around her. The cart sounds, the intercom, the ordinary rhythm of a hospital in the late morning hours. And she felt the specific weight of the last 10 hours settling into her body all at once. Her back hurt. Her eyes hurt. She'd had half a cup of coffee and nothing else since the previous night's shift. She was still sitting there when she heard it. The elevator at the end of the hall. Then voices. Not staff voices. Not the half-distracted murmur of people mid-task, but the clipped exchange of people coordinating. More than two, coming fast. She stood. Cross looked up. He'd heard it too. "Stay in this room," Emily said. She was at the door when the conference room window, the narrow strip of safety glass at head height, showed her the corridor, and she saw two of the lobby contractors moving toward her from the north end, and she saw something in the hand of the one in front that was not a credential wallet and was not a phone. Emily stepped back from the door and looked at Cross. "Get behind the table," she said. "What? Now." She moved to the side of the door, not behind it, beside it, and she felt the old geometry come back, the spatial math of a room, and a threat, and a body that needed to be in the right place. Her hands were empty. The room had chairs, a table, a whiteboard, a phone on the credenza that was definitely not going to be useful in the next 30 seconds. The door handle moved. In the corridor outside, someone shouted, a single sharp word, authoritative, and then there were running footsteps, more than two sets, and a different kind of voice. "Federal agents, hands where I can see them." The door handle stopped moving. Emily stayed where she was. There were sounds she couldn't see. Movement, voices overlapping, one sharp physical impact, and then a controlled-sounding series of commands, and then silence. And then the door opened, and a man in a dark jacket with a federal credentials wallet already extended looked at her across the threshold. "Emily Carter?" he said. "Yes." He looked at Cross behind the table, then back at her. "We have the corridor. Are you injured?" "No." She stepped away from the wall. He cooperated. "The documentation. We have your photos. We have everything." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalibrating what they thought they were walking into. "You want to tell me how a floor nurse contained a federal espionage suspect in a hospital conference room?" Emily picked up her bag from the chair where she'd left it. "I've had a long morning," she said. And from somewhere down the corridor, past the federal agents and the secured contractors and the ordinary Tuesday sounds of Rivergate Medical Center, her hospital pager went off again. A different code this time, the steady beep of a non-emergency alert. And underneath it, almost too quiet to register, was a sound she recognized instantly despite not having heard it in 14 months. The specific weight distribution click of a military working dog's tactical vest as the animal came down a corridor at speed. Titan came through the corridor like he owned it. He was moving on 3 legs. The left rear compensating for the flank wound, the gait uneven but fast, the tactical vest gone, and a clean bandage wrapped tight around his midsection. "Doctor." Pruitt had apparently decided that a sedated military working dog waking up in an unfamiliar facility was more of a liability than letting him follow whatever signal he was following, and she'd called ahead, Emily found out later, to say the dog had gotten up, oriented southeast, and started scratching at the kennel door with a focus that made further sedation seem inadvisable. He came straight to Emily. He didn't jump, didn't make a sound. He walked up to her and pressed the side of his head against her thigh and stood there, and Emily put her hand on him and felt the tension in his body, the controlled alertness of an animal that had come out of sedation in a strange place and made a decision about where it needed to be. The federal agent in the doorway watched this. "Yours?" he said. "Not officially," Emily said. Titan looked at the agent. The agent looked at Titan. The agent appeared to decide that this particular question could be revisited at a later time. The next 2 hours were the kind of organized chaos that only looks organized from the outside. The federal team, 7 agents, joint DOJ and DOD authorization, operating under a task force designation that Emily was told twice and didn't retain because it wasn't the part that mattered, worked the hospital floor by floor. They weren't loud about it. That was the first thing Pierce noticed when he came out of his office and found 2 agents in his hallway. They weren't broadcasting. They were methodical and quiet, and they moved like people who'd done this in harder environments than a mid-sized civilian hospital in Ashford City. Cross was formally arrested in the conference room at 12:41 p.m. Emily wasn't there for the moment itself. She was in the hallway with Titan and Marcus and Sandra Voss, who had materialized from somewhere around noon with the specific energy of a charge nurse who'd decided that whatever was happening on level 2 admin was her business, whether anyone agreed or not. Emily had stopped trying to manage the information perimeter. Around 11:30, the hospital knew something was happening.
the way hospitals always know, the information moving through break rooms and nursing stations, and the particular telephone game of shift handoffs until it arrived everywhere simultaneously and mostly wrong. What they mostly had right, federal agents, a surgeon, an arrest. What they mostly had wrong, everything else. Marcus handed Emily her phone back when she came out of the stairwell. He'd been holding it for 40 minutes, and he had the look of someone who'd spent those 40 minutes being very casually uninteresting, which had apparently required more effort than he'd anticipated. "Anyone ask?" she said. "One of the lobby guys, before they were detained." He shrugged. "I told him I was the transport aide and I didn't know anything about a nurse named Carter." Emily looked at him. Marcus Obi was 29 years old and had been a second-year resident for 6 months and had, in the span of about 14 hours, handled a military working dog in a trauma bay, rerouted suspicious personnel using a broken landline, and provided operational cover for a federal evidence chain without being asked to do any of it officially. "Thank you," Emily said. "Don't mention it." A pause. "Genuinely, please don't mention it to anyone in the program review committee." The lead agent's name was Varga, first name either withheld or not offered. Emily didn't push. She met with him in the consultation room at 1:15, the same beige-walled space where she'd read Darian's card that morning, which felt like a different week. Varga had a tablet and a legal pad, and the manner of someone who valued accuracy over speed. "Walk me through the timeline," he said. From the moment the patient was brought in, Emily walked him through it. All of it. The ER bay, the dog, the command in Flemish Dutch, Pierce's conversation, the card in the locker, Pruitt at the vet clinic, the records room, Cross in the sublevel, the conference room. She told it in sequence without editorializing, which was a habit from a different context that turned out to be useful here. Varga took notes. His pen moved in short, efficient strokes. When she was done, he looked up. "The locker," he said. "The card was placed there before you arrived this morning." "Yes. Which means someone with knowledge of your locker assignment and access to the building placed it between your shift end at 7 a.m. and your return at 9:30. That's what the timeline suggests." Varga wrote something. "You don't know who placed it." "I have a theory." "I'd like to hear it." Emily looked at the tissue box on the table. Wolf had been in this city for at least 48 hours before he came to the ER. Maybe longer. He knew the hospital, the administrative filing system, my locker number, the veterinary contact on Delacroix. He'd done reconnaissance. She looked back at Varga. He came to the ER because he was out of time, not because it was his first option. The locker card was already placed. He'd planned for the possibility that he wouldn't be able to deliver the information directly. "He was planning for his own death," Varga said. "He was planning for every outcome," Emily said. "That's what he did?" Varga set the pen down. He looked at her with the careful assessment of someone deciding how much a situation calls for. "You were medically discharged 18 months ago. The circumstances are sealed." "Yes." "You've been working as a floor nurse at this hospital for 14 months." "Yes." "Wolf trusted you specifically, came to this city specifically, left evidence in a location only you could access." Varga's expression didn't change. "That's a significant degree of trust for someone the Army effectively erased from the operational record." Emily held his gaze. "Darian Wolf was the best judge of operational reliability I've ever met. If he decided I was the right person for this, I don't have a reason to second-guess him." "I'm not second-guessing him," Varga said. "I'm trying to understand the full picture." "The full picture," Emily said, "is that 4 soldiers died in an operation that was compromised by a man who spent the last 3 years working 20 feet from the surgical supply closet on level 3. The full picture is that their families have been waiting 3 years for a reason. The full picture is that Wolf spent 18 months building a case that got him killed." She paused. "Whatever questions you have about my discharge or my record, I'll answer them. But those are the things that matter." Varga looked at her for a moment, then he picked his pen back up. "Tell me about Vantegra Holdings." Cross's attorney arrived at 2:30. The arrest processing moved to a federal facility on the other side of Ashford City, which meant Cross left Rivergate in handcuffs through the main entrance. Not the back exit, not the physician's parking access, but the front doors. past the lobby, past the reception desk, past 17 staff members who had various reasons to be near the entrance at 2:45 in the afternoon and who went very still when they saw it. Pierce was in the lobby. He'd positioned himself there, Emily realized deliberately, not to watch, or not only to watch. He was standing at the edge of the reception area with his hands clasped behind him and his face doing something that took her a moment to read. He was bearing witness. It was the only word for it. The deliberate presence of someone who had understood that what was happening required acknowledgement and had decided to be present for it rather than behind a closed office door. Cross didn't look at Pierce as he was walked through. He looked straight ahead with the compressed expression of a man trying to move through a public moment with the minimum amount of himself showing. The two federal agents flanking him moved efficiently. The whole thing took 40 seconds from door to vehicle, and then the vehicle was gone, and the lobby had the specific suspended silence of a space that has just witnessed something it will be talking about for years. Pierce turned and saw Emily. She was at the corridor entrance. Titan was beside her. The dog had stopped limping as aggressively as the morning wore on, though he still favored the left rear, and he'd taken to staying within arm's reach of Emily in the way of an animal that had made a territorial decision and wasn't advertising it. Pierce walked over. He looked at Titan, then at Emily. His face had done more in the last 6 hours than Emily had seen it do in 14 months combined. Something had loosened, or perhaps something had finally cracked that had been held rigid by the sustained pressure of not knowing what was actually happening in his hospital. Cross has been here for 4 years, Pierce said. It wasn't directed at Emily specifically. It was the sound of a man recalculating. I know, Emily said. He had surgical privileges, full administrative access. I reviewed his credentialing personally when he joined the advisory board. Pierce looked at the door where the vehicle had been. He was recommended by the chair of the board, came with a record that there was no indication there wouldn't be, Emily said. That's how this works. The recommendation came from Vantegra's network. The credentialing trail was clean. Everything above the surface was designed to look right. Pierce looked at her. How long have you known? I've known what I could confirm since this morning. She met his eyes. I had a suspicion about the shape of things before that, but suspicion isn't evidence. And Wolf, the man who died, he'd been building the evidence. For 18 months. Yes. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Around them, the lobby was returning to its ordinary rhythm. People moving, phones ringing, the front desk resuming its function with the slightly heightened energy of a place that had just experienced something and was now processing it through the mechanism of getting back to work. Your personnel file, Pierce said. The incomplete one. Yes? I'd like to understand what's in it. Some of it's sealed, Emily said. The parts that aren't, Agent Varga can brief you on what's relevant to the hospital's situation. I'd suggest scheduling that conversation for tomorrow. Today's probably full. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. You've been here 14 months, he said. Yes. Doing floor nursing. Yes. He seemed to be working toward something, the specific deliberate approach of a man who had gotten where he was, partly by never saying things he'd have to unsay. I owe you an apology, he said finally. Not for the last 14 months, for this morning specifically, when I told you to leave. Emily shook her head slightly. You were working with what you had. I was working with what I'd been fed, he said, with a precision that suggested he'd arrived at that phrasing on his own and meant it exactly. There's a difference. He straightened. Your position here is secure. Whatever paperwork needs to happen to formalize that, it'll happen. Titan, who had been sitting with the patience of an animal that was technically off duty and therefore not obligated to maintain any particular posture, yawned. It was the most normal sound Emily had heard all day. Thank you, she said to Pierce. He nodded once and went back to his office, and Emily stood in the lobby with her hand on a military working dog's back and felt, for the first time since 11:47 the previous night, like she could take a breath that went all the way down. Varga found her in the break room at 4 p.m. She was eating a sandwich she'd gotten from the cafeteria. Turkey on wheat, nothing on it because the condiment station had been out of mustard, and she hadn't had the energy to look for an alternative.
and she was sitting at the table by the window that looked out at the Kellerman Street parking structure, and she was not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of accomplishment. Varga sat across from her without asking. He had coffee from somewhere, which suggested he'd found the machine on 3 that nobody officially admitted existed. "Cross is cooperating," he said. Emily looked up. "Partial," Varga clarified. "He's lawyered up, and the cooperation is strategic. He's offering information in exchange for sentencing consideration. But the initial debrief gave us 3 names we didn't have. Vantegra's principals? 2 of them. And a third contact, someone who provided Cross with access to the operational intelligence from Ogren." Varga turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Emily, the third contact is still active." She put the sandwich down and saw it. "Still active meaning not Cross, not the contractors we detained today, not anyone in the Vantegra financial chain we've already mapped." Varga looked at her directly. "Someone who provided intelligence access from inside the DOD apparatus. Cross gave us enough to narrow it significantly, but the identification isn't confirmed yet." Emily looked at the parking structure. A car was backing out of a space on the second level, and the brake lights were red against the concrete, and everything in her field of vision was ordinary, and none of it was landing quite right. "The Ogren operation," she said. "The intelligence breach that compromised the mission. You're saying it had 2 sources." "Cross was the conduit," Varga said. "But the raw intelligence, the operational position data, the timing, the personnel assignments, that didn't come from Cross. He didn't have that access. Someone fed it to him." Emily had known, sitting in the sublevel with Cross's papers scattered on the floor, that the shape of what Darien had found was larger than one man in one hospital. She'd known it and set it aside because one problem at a time was the only viable approach to a day like this one had been. But she'd known. "Wolf's notes," she said. "The 3 lines on the first card." "Yes. We've been working on that reference since you sent us the photos. The alphanumeric sequence in the first card isn't a file number. It's a personnel identifier." Varga set the coffee down. "We're running it. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this doesn't end with Cross." Emily looked at him. "I've been prepared for that since last night. There's something else." Plus, Varga reached into his jacket. Not a weapon, not credentials, a folded paper that he smoothed onto the table between them. "Cross said one other thing in the debrief. He said the third contact knew you were in Ashford City, knew which hospital, knew your cover employment." The break room was quiet. The sandwich was uneaten. Emily looked at the paper, which had a printed alphanumeric sequence on it, and she looked at it for several seconds before she understood what she was looking at. It was a personnel identifier. She recognized the format because she'd spent years in a system that used it. 8 characters, specific structure. The third character, a letter that indicated division. The third character was a V medical corps. She looked at Varga. "How long have you had this?" she said. "Cross gave it to us 40 minutes ago." "And you ran it?" "We ran it?" Varga's voice was careful, not soft, but precise, the tone of someone delivering a specific payload. "The identifier belongs to someone who was medically discharged from the Army 18 months ago, someone whose file is sealed." Emily sat very still. "Emily," Varga said, "the identifier in Cross's debrief." "It's mine," she said. "Yes." The break room hum, the refrigerator, the ventilation, the ordinary ambient sounds of a room that had nothing to do with any of this, continued without interruption, indifferent to the specific shape of what had just happened. "Cross says the third contact used your identifier to route intelligence," Varga said. "Your access codes from when you were still active duty. Someone who had your credentials, your actual system credentials, used them to pull the operational data and pass it to Cross." "That's not possible," Emily said. "My credentials were revoked at discharge." "They should have been." Varga held her gaze. "They weren't." Emily put both hands flat on the table. She looked at them. Her hands, which had been steady through 22 minutes of resuscitation this morning, through a code blue, through a conversation with a man she was fairly certain had intended to do her harm, her hands were very slightly unsteady now. "Someone left my access active," she said. "Deliberately." That's our current read. And used it to pull classified position data from an active operation. Yes. And when the operation went wrong, she stopped, started again. When 4 people died and the mission was investigated, the evidence trail pointed back to credentials belonging to a medically discharged combat medic who was no longer in the system to defend herself. Varga didn't say anything. The sealed discharge, Emily said. The words came slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she was building something out of pieces she'd had for a long time and not been able to assemble correctly. I was discharged under circumstances that were never fully explained to me. I was told it was medical. I was told the record was sealed for my protection. She looked up. Whose protection was it actually for? That's what we're trying to determine, Varga said. Cross doesn't know the identity of the third contact. He received the intelligence through a secure dead drop. No direct communication. The only traceable element is the credential identifier, which is yours. He paused. But, Emily, someone set this up before the Ogren operation, before your discharge. They had your credentials in advance. Someone inside the medical corps, Emily said. Someone with administrative access to the credentialing system. Yes. She thought about the reimbursement form she'd found in the records room, the authorized signatory, the name from the Ogren debrief that had appeared on a Rivergate document 14 months ago. She thought about the 4 men in the lobby this morning. She thought about the way Cross had looked at her in the sub-level, the specific recalibration of a man who had just recognized something. You were always the problem, he'd almost said, the mask slipping before he'd caught it. He knew who I was, Emily said slowly. Cross, in the sub-level, when we were talking, he said I was the medic from Ogren. He recognized me. She looked at Varga. He didn't recognize me from 14 months of working in the same hospital. He recognized me from a file. Yes. Which means he had access to my actual file, not the cover employment record, not the civilian nursing file, my actual sealed military record. Which means the third contact had access to it too, Varga said, and shared it with Cross. The implication settled. Emily stood up. Not abruptly, carefully, the way you stand when you're recalibrating your physical relationship to a space because the space has just changed. The men in the lobby, she said. The 4 contractors. In custody. Did any of them talk? 2 of them. Partial. They were told this was a retrieval operation, told there was a document cache in a hospital in Ashford City that needed to be secured before a federal investigation team arrived. Varga stood as well. They were hired through an intermediary, encrypted communication, cryptocurrency, the usual architecture for this kind of contract. The intermediary. We're working on it. Emily looked at the door. The third contact knew Wolf was coming to this hospital, she said. Knew Wolf had been building the case, sent the contractors to intercept the documentation before the federal team arrived. She thought about the timing. The contractors had entered the lobby hours before Varga's team showed up. They had advanced knowledge of your timeline. Varga's expression shifted. Barely, but Emily caught it. How advanced? She said. We think the asset inside the DoD was monitoring our communication channels. Varga's voice had gotten flatter. We've been running this investigation in a compartment, but if the same person who maintained access to your credentials had the right positioning, they knew you were coming, Emily said. So they sent people to get here first. Yes. And Cross had already been briefed to destroy the documentation the moment anyone showed up asking questions. That's our read. Emily looked at the paper on the table, the alphanumeric sequence, 8 characters with a V in the 3rd position. You need to find who kept my credentials active, she said. We know. And whoever it is, they're not in Ashford City. They're not in this building. She looked at Varga. They sent proxies. They always send proxies. Yes. So they're still out there. Varga picked up the paper, folded it back the way it had come. There's something else Cross gave us. A location, not an address, more of a description. A facility where the dead drop communications were staged. He looked at Emily. It's a medical facility. Emily waited. A rehabilitation center, Varga said. In a city called Millhaven, about 200 miles north of here. It's a private facility.
Contracted through the VA system for transitional care for discharged veterans. He paused. Cross said the contact who arranged the dead drop identified themselves as a physician. The VA. Transitional care for discharged veterans. A physician. Emily felt the geometry of it assembling, the access required, the positioning, the ability to maintain surveillance on a medically discharged combat medic's civilian employment history without triggering any system that would flag the inquiry. A VA-contracted physician would have the credentialing system access, would have the kind of institutional invisibility that came from being adjacent to the military apparatus without being technically inside it. Would have known where Emily was for 14 months, would have known where Darian Wolfe was too. Millhaven, Emily said. We're coordinating with the field office there now. She looked at Varga. How long? They're trying to... Her personal pager went off. Not the hospital pager. The personal one. The one that had been silent since 10 that morning. Emily looked at the display. A number she didn't recognize. Not the federal contact number. Not any number she had saved. A Millhaven area code. She looked at Varga. He looked at the pager. Don't answer it, he said immediately. If they're paging me, they know I'm still here, Emily said. They know the operation failed. They know Cross is in custody. She looked at the display. They're not calling to threaten me. Then why? Because they want to know how much we have, she said. And they think if they talk to me directly, they can figure it out. She looked at Varga. Can your team triangulate the source if I keep them on long enough? Varga was already reaching for his own phone. Yes, he said. But, Emily, I know what I'm doing, she said, and picked up the pager. The number was still on the display, cycling through its alert pattern, patient and deliberate as someone who had time and knew it. Emily stared at it. And in the doorway of the break room, where she hadn't been 30 seconds ago, Sandra Voss appeared, her face arranged in the careful blankness of someone who had just heard something through a door she hadn't meant to be standing outside. Emily, Sandra said. Her voice was wrong. There's a man at the front desk. He's been there for 10 minutes. He says he's a physician from a facility called Millhaven Transitional. She stopped. He asked for you by name, not Carter. He asked for your name from before. The pager in Emily's hand went silent. Emily's name from before was Sergeant Emily Rourke. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 18 months. The discharge paperwork said Carter, her mother's name, the name she'd used for the civilian nursing license, the name on the Rivergate ID badge currently clipped to her scrub pocket. Rourke was the name on 4 commendation certificates that were in a manila envelope in the back of her closet under a box of things she hadn't unpacked and wasn't planning to. Only a very specific category of person knew both names. She looked at Sandra. What does he look like? 60s, gray hair. He came in through the main entrance, no badge, no appointment. He told the desk he was a colleague. Is he still there? As of 3 minutes ago. Emily turned to Varga. He was already on his phone, 2 fingers up. Give me 30 seconds. And moving toward the door with the controlled urgency of someone switching operational gears. She gave him the 30 seconds. He used 20 of them. My team is repositioning to the lobby, he said. You don't go down there alone. He walked in through the front door, Emily said, in the middle of a federal operation. That's not a man running. That's a man who thinks he still has options, which makes him more dangerous, or more desperate. She looked at Titan, who had gotten to his feet the moment the energy in the room changed, reading it the way working dogs read everything. Not the words, the current underneath them. How long to get your people in position? They're already moving. 4 minutes. Sandra. Emily looked at the charge nurse. I need you to clear the lobby. Not a code, just redirect. Tell the desk there's a hazmat concern in the parking structure. Routine protocol. Ask people to move to the east waiting area. Sandra absorbed this with the expression of a woman who had spent 19 years at Rivergate and had long since made peace with the fact that her job sometimes required her to do things without a full explanation. Done, she said, and was gone. Emily looked at Varga. 4 minutes, she said. I'll wait. She waited 3.5. The lobby was mostly clear when she came down. The desk attendant had moved to the east corridor per Sandra's instructions, and 3 of the 4 people who'd been in the waiting area had followed. The 4th, an elderly man with a cane who appeared to be waiting for someone and had decided the hazmat notice didn't apply to him, remained in the far chair reading a magazine with the focused indifference of a person who had survived enough to know what was actually worth moving for. The man from Millhaven was standing near the information stand in the center of the lobby. He was exactly as Sandra had described: 60s, gray hair, the kind of physical stillness that reads as either patience or calculation depending on context. He wore civilian clothes, nothing remarkable, no briefcase, no visible bag. His hands were at his sides. He looked like a physician, the way certain people look like whatever they needed to look like for the situation they were in. The presentation was real enough, but it was also constructed, the way a good cover always is. Emily walked toward him. Titan walked beside her. She hadn't told him to. He'd simply positioned himself there at the stairwell and held the line, and she'd decided not to argue with 70 pounds of considered tactical judgment. The man saw her when she was 15 feet away. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the adjustment of a man who had been running a probability assessment and just had a variable confirmed. He looked at Titan, then at her. "Sergeant Rourke," he said. "Not anymore," Emily said. She stopped 6 feet from him. "Who are you?" "My name is Dr. Elliot Marsh." He said it evenly, as if names were the least complicated part of this conversation. "I've been at Millhaven Transitional for 11 years.
I was the one who maintained your credentials after your discharge." Emily had known it was coming. Varga had laid the framework. The logic was there. But hearing it out loud still landed differently than anticipating it. There was a beat where she simply absorbed it. "You kept my access active," she said. "Yes." "And used it to route operational intelligence out of active missions." "I routed information," Marsh said. "I didn't decide what was done with it." 4 people died. He didn't look away. To his credit, if that word applied, he didn't look away. "I know." "Say their names." Something shifted in his expression. Tran, Achebe, Hollowell, Odemba." Emily said each one clearly. "They had names. If you're going to stand here and tell me you were just routing information, the least you can do is know the names of what that information cost." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I came here because I want to cooperate," he said. "That's why I walked in through the front door. I could have run. I've had 48 hours to run since I understood how far Wolf's investigation had gotten." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't run." "Why not?" He seemed to consider the question as if it genuinely required thought. "Because I've been doing this for 11 years and I'm tired," he said. "And because Cross being arrested this morning means it ends either way, and I'd rather have some agency in how it ends." A pause. "And because I looked at your file, your actual file. What was done to you? The discharge, the sealed record, using your credentials as a liability buffer. That was not something I agreed to when I started." Emily studied him. She was looking for the performance layer, the practiced sincerity of a man who'd spent years reading other people's vulnerabilities and knew how to arrange his own face. She could see some of it, but underneath it was something that looked reluctantly like the real thing. "You didn't agree to it," she said, "but you let it happen." "Yes." "For 11 years. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm not here to make a case for myself. I'm here because the federal team that arrested Cross this morning is going to find me in 48 hours regardless, and I'd rather be the person who walked in than the person who was walked in." He glanced past her, toward the corridor where she knew Varga's people were positioned. "I assume they're already here." "They are." "Then I'd like to speak with them." He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, with the self-conscious care of a man who understood exactly how the gesture might be read. He produced a folded document. "I brought a hard copy of everything: access logs, communication records, the full Vantegra transfer chain, and the 3 additional names in the DOD apparatus who were part of this." He held it out. Wolf was close. He had 2 of the 3. I have the 3rd. Emily looked at this document. She didn't take it.
Why give it to me? She said. Marsh lowered his hand slightly. Because you're the one who's owed it, he said simply. Whatever else I've done wrong, I can at least get that part right. Titan made a sound, not aggressive, just present. A low exhale through his nose that was probably the dog equivalent of, I'm watching you. And Marsh looked at him with an expression that was, briefly, something close to human. Wolf trained him, Marsh said. I know, Emily said. He talked about you. In his operational reports, the ones he filed with the contact who eventually passed them to me. Marsh looked at Emily. He said you were the most reliable person he'd ever worked with. That if the operation ever came apart at the wrong moment, you were the one he'd want to know about it. A pause. He wasn't wrong. Emily took the document. She turned around. Varga was already crossing the lobby. Schatzung. Elliot Marsh was placed under federal arrest at 4:57 p.m. in the lobby of Rivergate Medical Center, in front of the elderly man with the magazine who watched the entire thing with the measured interest of someone who had decided the hazmat notice definitely didn't apply to him, and had been right. The processing took less time than Cross's had. Marsh was cooperative in the specific way of a man who had made a decision and was executing it without second-guessing. He answered questions, he clarified the document, he confirmed 3 names that Varga relayed to 2 other field offices before the handcuffs were on. Emily watched from the corridor entrance. Titan sat beside her. She thought about the 11 years, not with the hot velocity of anger, that had burned somewhere earlier in the day and left something cooler behind, something that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't acceptance, but was the specific hard clarity of a person who has seen the full shape of a thing and is deciding what to do with the seeing. 11 years of Marsh at a VA contracted facility, adjacent to the system, maintaining access he shouldn't have had, making himself useful to people who used usefulness as currency. 11 years of knowing and not stopping and telling himself the distinction between routing and deciding was meaningful. It wasn't. But Emily also knew that people did things for 11 years for reasons that were complicated and then ran out of the energy to maintain the complication. And she wasn't interested in making Marsh into a monster because monsters were easier to process than people who simply made choices that they kept making until stopping felt impossible. 4 soldiers were dead either way. She looked at the document in her hand. Varga had taken the original into evidence, but he'd handed her a copy. Not protocol, probably, but also not something she was going to question. She folded it and put it in her bag. The formal case review started the following morning. It ran for 6 days. Emily was interviewed 3 times, by Varga's team, by a separate DOD Inspector General investigator named Pratt, who had a voice like gravel and asked her questions with the patient inexorability of a person who had done this for 30 years, and once by a joint panel that included a JAG attorney and 2 people whose agency affiliations were not introduced. She answered all of it. She asked, on the 2nd day, whether she was being treated as a witness or a subject, and Pratt told her witness without hesitation, which told her Marsh's documentation had been sufficient for the questions about her credentials to shift from open to answered. The 3 names Marsh had provided opened cases in 2 other cities. Emily wasn't briefed on the details of those. They were beyond her direct scope, Varga said. But she understood from what he did tell her that the Vantegra network was substantially larger than a single hospital in Ashford City, and that what Darian Wolf had built over 18 months was the anchor point the investigation had needed to pull the rest of it into view. On the 4th day, the Inspector General's office formally reopened the Ogren Operational Review. Pratt told her in the corridor outside the interview room, not with ceremony, but with the direct simplicity of a man delivering information that was owed. The review would be comprehensive. All 4 deaths, the intelligence breach, the chain of responsibility from the original planning stage through to the cover-up. The sealed records would be unsealed. The operational finding of unit failure would be suspended pending the new review. How long? Emily asked. Review process takes 60 to 90 days, Pratt said. The conclusions, based on what we have, and we have a significant amount, will not be favorable to the people who authored the original finding. Emily looked at the wall. The families, she said. Trans family, Achebes, they've had 3 years of nothing. The notification process will begin before the review concludes. We don't make families wait for bureaucratic timelines. Pratt looked at her.
That part moves quickly. I'll make sure of it personally." She believed him. Not because he was a federal investigator and not because she was supposed to, but because he said it with the weight of a man who'd seen the wrong end of the notification process enough times to have made it a personal commitment rather than a policy position. "Thank you," she said. Pratt nodded once and walked away, and Emily stood in the corridor and felt the specific internal shifting of a thing that had been load-bearing for a long time beginning, slowly, to release. The formal apology from Rivergate Medical Center came on the 5th day. Pierce had written it himself. Emily could tell, from the slightly formal phrasing and the absence of the kind of careful legal hedging that an attorney would have inserted. It was addressed to her by name. It acknowledged the circumstances of the previous week's request that she vacate the premises, and it confirmed her position at Rivergate with full status and back pay for any shifts affected. It did not attempt to explain itself beyond what it could actually account for. Pierce had the good judgment to apologize for what he'd done, and not for things that were outside his knowledge, which Emily respected more than she would have respected a wider apology that tried to cover more ground than it honestly could. She was in his office when she read it. He sat across the desk and watched her read it with the expression of a man doing something uncomfortable that he'd decided was necessary. When she looked up, he said, "I've been in this business for 27 years, and I've made a lot of calls I've had to revisit. This one," he stopped, started again. "I accepted a characterization of you that I didn't examine because it fit a conclusion I'd already started to reach. I don't usually operate that way." "You didn't have context," Emily said. "I should have asked for it." She looked at the letter. "It's a good apology," she said. "Most people can't write one that actually says what it means." Pierce seemed uncertain whether that was a compliment or an observation, which was fair because it was both. "The position," he said. "Charge nurse, if you want it. South Wing has needed a permanent charge for 4 months, and Sandra has been covering it on top of her own load." He paused. "That's not charity. Sandra told me to offer it or she'd apply for your job, and your job doesn't exist yet." Emily put the letter in her bag. "Tell Sandra I'll think about it." "She'll want an answer faster than that." "Then tell her I'll think about it quickly." Pierce almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but the intention was there. On the 6th day, the Army called. Not Varga, not Pratt, an actual call from the Department of the Army, routed through a number that Emily's personal pager flagged with a contact code she hadn't seen in 18 months. She was in her car in the Rivergate parking structure when it came through, eating a granola bar at 7:15 in the morning because she'd been back on shift the previous night and the cafeteria wasn't open yet. The call was from a Colonel Yates, who had a title that included the words personnel review and special circumstances, and who spoke with the precise efficiency of a person who had been in the Army long enough to know that the most respectful thing you could do for someone's time was not waste it. "Sergeant Rourke," Yates said. "Carter," Emily said. "Officially." "Sergeant Rourke, per your original service record," Yates said without argument, which told her the record was already unlocked. "I'm calling to inform you that your discharge classification is under formal review by the IG's office and the Personnel Command simultaneously. Based on preliminary findings, the circumstances of your separation do not meet the evidentiary standard required to sustain a medical discharge classification." Emily stopped chewing. "What that means in practical terms," Yates continued, "is that your discharge is expected to be reclassified as honorable separation upon conclusion of the review. Your service record will be corrected to reflect your full citation history, which includes 2 commendations that were administratively suppressed at the time of your discharge." She looked out the windshield at the parking structure's concrete wall. "Additionally," Yates said, "the IG's office has requested your participation in an advisory capacity during the remainder of the Ogren review. This is voluntary. It would involve 3 site visits over the 60-day review period and written consultation on the operational intelligence timeline. You would be compensated as a civilian contractor, and your Rivergate employment would not be affected." Emily was quiet for a moment. "The 4 soldiers," she said, "Tran, Achebe, Hollowell, Odemba. Their records." "Being corrected," Yates said. "As of this week. The operational finding of unit failure is being expunged. Their service classifications will reflect the correct circumstances of their deaths. Notification to families is already in process. The first two were contacted yesterday. Emily closed her eyes, opened them. The parking structure wall was still there, gray and ordinary. A Tuesday morning, the sound of someone's car starting 2 levels down. "I'll participate in the advisory review," she said. "I'll send the paperwork today." "Colonel?" She stopped him before he could close the call. "The commendations that were suppressed."
I don't need them reinstated to my file. I know what they were for. A pause. But I'd like the families of those 4 soldiers to know what the full record says. All of it. What they were doing, what they accomplished before it went wrong, what they were trying to protect. A brief silence. "That can be arranged," Yates said. "Thank you." She ended the call and sat in her car with the granola bar in her hand and the engine off and the quiet of the parking structure around her. She was not going to let herself cry in the Rivergate parking structure at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. She had made that decision without consciously making it, the way she made most decisions, and she held to it. But it was a near thing.
Titan was formally released from Ashford Veterinary Emergency on day 7. The paperwork was complicated. He was military property, technically, and his handler was dead, and the bureaucratic process for reassigning a working dog involved 3 different agencies and a form that Emily was fairly sure had been designed by someone who had never interacted with an actual dog. Varga expedited what he could. Pruitt contributed a veterinary assessment that used the phrase bonded placement, strongly recommended with a clinical specificity that made it very difficult to argue with. Emily signed the final form in the Rivergate parking structure, leaning against the hood of her car, with Titan sitting beside her looking at her pen with the focused attention of an animal who had opinions about things and expressed them through proximity. She drove him home. He walked through her apartment door, investigated the cactus on the windowsill with forensic thoroughness, and selected the end of the couch farthest from the door as his preferred location. Emily stood in the kitchen and watched him and drank a cup of coffee that actually made it all the way to the bottom of the mug, which was something she hadn't managed in a week. She thought about Darian Wolfe. She'd been thinking about him in managed intervals, not suppressing it, just scheduling it, the way you deal with anything that's too large for continuous processing. She thought about him now with the full weight she'd been keeping in partition, the card games, the $40 she'd never collected, the way he'd grabbed her wrist in the ER bay with a grip that was purposeful and not desperate, the grip of a man transferring something, not holding on. He'd known. He'd come to this city, set everything up, and then walked into that ER bay knowing the probability of what was going to happen to him, and he'd done it anyway because the alternative was letting it stay buried. And Darian Wolfe had never once in his life made peace with something buried that deserved to be brought into the light. She owed him the same. She would pay it. Through the advisory review, through the testimony, through whatever part of the next year was spent in offices answering questions under oath, she would pay it. Not as debt exactly, more as continuation. The work he'd started was going to get finished, and that was the only kind of honoring she understood. She put the coffee cup in the sink and looked out at the Kelvin Street Bridge. The cactus was still there on the windowsill. She'd had it for 14 months, and it looked exactly the same as the day she'd bought it. Not thriving, not dying, just persisting with a kind of indestructible indifference that she'd found oddly comforting. She looked at it for a moment, then at Titan, who had rearranged himself on the couch and was watching her with the calm attention of a dog who had decided his situation was acceptable. She should name the cactus. She'd been thinking that on and off for 14 months. She'd always stopped herself because naming things made them harder to leave, and she'd been living in a low-crouch readiness to leave since she'd arrived. The way you live when you're not entirely sure you're allowed to stay. She looked at the cactus. "Wolf," she said aloud to nobody. It felt right, in the way that small things sometimes feel right. Not dramatic, just correct. A name for something that survived without much water, in a small space, in a city it hadn't planned on. She took the charge nurse position. Sandra's response, when Emily told her, was a single raised eyebrow and a coffee cup slid across the nursing station desk, which was Sandra's version of a party. The first week in the charge role was genuinely difficult in ways Emily hadn't entirely anticipated. Not the clinical responsibilities, which fit like a piece she'd always had the right shape for, but the administrative dimension. the management of people, the navigation of departmental politics that were considerably more complex than they appeared from the floor. She made 3 decisions she second-guessed. She had one conversation with a resident that went badly wrong and then had it again, better, 48 hours later. She forgot to eat lunch on Thursday. She was imperfect at it. She was also, by the end of the first week, better at it than when she'd started, which was the only metric that mattered. Marcus brought it up on Friday, at the end of a shift that had been long in the specific way of shifts, where everything happens slightly wrong and gets corrected and then happens slightly wrong again. "You're different," he said. Not in a bad way. He said it with the curious observation of someone who was genuinely trying to identify a change. "Different how?" Emily said. "Like you know you're staying." He shrugged. "Before it always felt like you were visiting, like you had one foot somewhere else." He looked at her. What changed? Emily thought about how to answer that. She thought about the parking structure and the granola bar and Colonel Yates on the phone. She thought about Marcia's document and the names on the second page and a 24-year-old from outside Baton Rouge who'd owed her $40. "I finished something," she said. Marcus considered this. "And now?" "Now I start something else." He seemed to find that satisfying in the way of a person who doesn't need the full story to understand the shape of it. He refilled his coffee and went back to his notes, and Emily went back to hers, and the South Wing nursing station hummed with the ordinary business of people trying to keep other people alive. The formal recognition ceremony was not Emily's idea. It was Pierce's, organized quietly, without press, in the hospital's main conference room on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks after the arrest. There were about 30 people, department heads, nursing staff, 2 federal representatives, including Varga, Colonel Yates attending in person, and Sandra Voss standing at the back with an expression that suggested she'd known about this for at least a week and had managed to say nothing, which she considered a personal achievement. Titan was also present. Pierce had authorized it with the specific expression of a man who had decided that arguing with the situation was not worth his energy. The dog sat beside Emily's chair and observed the proceedings with the dignified composure of an animal who understood that this was an occasion and was prepared to behave accordingly. Yates spoke first. He read into the record the corrected discharge classification, the reinstated service history, the restored commendation citations, and the formal finding from the Ogren Review. Unanimous, he said, in its conclusion that the operational failure had been externally engineered and that no member of the deployed unit bore responsibility for the outcome. He said it formally. He said it on the record. He said it in a room full of people who would remember hearing it. Emily sat and listened and kept her face level and did not think about the parking structure or the cactus or the $40 until after Yates had finished, at which point she thought about all 3 of them at once and had to look at the middle distance for a moment until her vision cleared. Vargas said fewer words, a brief summary of the Vantegra investigation's current status, which he described as ongoing and which Emily understood to mean that the 3 names Marsh had provided were generating their own cases in their own jurisdictions. He thanked Emily's cooperation without making it sound like a formality. She appreciated that. Pierce spoke last. He stood at the front of the room with his hands clasped in front of him and looked at Emily and said what he'd said in his office, but publicly this time. That he'd accepted a characterization without examination, that the characterization had been wrong, that he was sorry. Not a long speech. Not a speech that tried to redeem itself with volume. Just a man saying a specific thing he meant, to the person it was owed to, in front of witnesses. Emily stood when he was done. She hadn't prepared anything. That was a deliberate choice. Not spontaneity for its own sake, but because anything she wrote in advance would have been the wrong shape for the room. She looked at the people in front of her, Marcus in the 3rd row, Sandra at the back, Varga with his arms crossed and his expression doing that thing where it was more than neutral without quite being warm. And she spoke the way she'd talked in debrief rooms for years, which was to say, without decoration. The soldiers who died in the Ogren operation were not failed by their training, their instincts, or each other, she said. They were failed by people in positions of trust who used that trust as a financial instrument. That's not a military problem or a government problem. It's a human problem. People rationalize. They tell themselves the information they're passing doesn't reach the people it kills. They draw the line somewhere after the thing they're doing and call it clean. She paused. Sergeant Wolf spent 18 months refusing to let that stand. He didn't have institutional support. He didn't have a team. He had a dog, and a very specific kind of stubbornness, and a belief that accuracy mattered even when, especially when, it was inconvenient. She looked at Titan. He was right. Titan looked back at her with his dark, patient eyes. "I'm not going to say this was worth it," Emily said. 4 people are still dead. Their families have the truth now, and that's not nothing. It's not nothing at all. But it's not the same as having their people back. The truth is the minimum. It's what you owed them from the beginning. She looked at the room. The minimum should have been paid 3 years ago. It wasn't. And the reason it wasn't is because the people who built the cover-up believed that nobody who was left would push hard enough to pull it apart. She let that sit for a moment. "They were wrong about Wolf," she said, "and they were wrong about me." The room was quiet. "I'm a floor nurse," Emily said. "That's what I am here, and I'm good at it, and I intend to keep being it. What I was before, that's documented now, in the right places, in the correct record. I don't need it on my badge." She looked at Pierce. "I just need the work to mean something." It wasn't the most eloquent thing she'd ever said. It was also exactly what she meant, without a single word borrowed from the version of herself that would have shaped it for an audience. Pierce nodded. Varga uncrossed his arms. Sandra Voss, in the back of the room, said nothing and was louder for it. After, when the room had mostly emptied and someone had put out coffee that was slightly too strong and cookies that Titan was eyeing with transparent intent, Marcus found her near the window. $40, he said. Emily looked at him. "You mentioned $40 once," Marcus said. "When Titan first came in and you were, I don't know, you were somewhere else for a second. You said something about $40. She hadn't realized she'd said it aloud. "The card game, Baton Rouge." "Someone owed it to me," she said. "Did you collect?" Emily looked out the window at the city, Ashford, which she had not planned to come to and had come to anyway, where she had spent 14 months being invisible by choice and had then, for 6 days, been the most visible thing in the building. The Kelvin Street Bridge was visible from this angle, just barely, the cables catching the late afternoon light. "No," she said. "I'm going to let it go." Marcus nodded slowly. He seemed to understand it was about more than the money, because Marcus was not the kind of person who missed things. "Good," he said. She clipped her badge back on. South Wing Charge Nurse, E. Carter. The photo was from her first week at Rivergate, when she'd smiled slightly because the photographer had asked her to, and she'd complied out of reflex. And the result looked like a woman who was in the middle of deciding something. Not happy, not unhappy, just in the process. She looked different now, she thought. Or maybe the same. It was hard to tell from the inside. Titan pressed against her knee. She put her hand on him and walked back through the conference room door, past the cookies he'd been watching, and out into the corridor where the hospital was doing what it always did. Continuing, without pause, the relentless business of keeping people alive. A cart went by. Somebody's phone rang at the station. A resident emerged from a room with the particular harried expression of someone who had just figured out they'd been doing something wrong for 20 minutes and needed to fix it. Normal. Loud. Imperfect. She walked into it. Some people spend years making themselves invisible because they've been taught that being seen is dangerous. That if you show the full weight of what you carry, someone will use it against you. They get good at it. They get so good that eventually even they forget what they were hiding under all that quiet. Emily Carter had been invisible for 14 months. She wasn't anymore. And the thing about being seen, she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the middle of a Tuesday in a hospital that had almost let her go, was that it was not the same as being exposed. Being seen meant someone knew you were there, knew what you'd done, knew what it cost, and said, that mattered. You mattered. The work was real. That was the thing worth staying for. Every morning after that, she clipped on her badge, and Titan walked beside her, and the people she passed in the corridor, staff, patients, residents who'd heard pieces of the story and assembled it into something half right. They moved a little differently around her. Not deferentially, just with the awareness of people who understood now that the woman in the South Wing charge position had carried more than a stethoscope for the last year and a half, and had not once set it down. She would have done it all again. Not for the recognition, not for the reinstated record or the corrected citations or Pierce's apology or the formal ceremony in the conference room. She would have done it because Darian Wolf sent a dog to an ER bay at midnight and trusted that the right person would know what to do next. She'd been that person. She intended to keep being her.